The Hippolytus is different from the other plays we've read this semester. It's the only play that we've read that is really explicitly about erotic love. And it's interesting that it gets at the question of erotic love by raising a related question, by raising a question about the nature of moderation, in Greek, sophrosune. But here, I mean, moderation can, in certain situations, mean chastity, and that's what it seems often to mean in this play. So we talked quite a bit last time about Phaedra's sophrosune. We'll come back to it today briefly, but what we really need to talk about is Hippolytus' sophrosune, his chastity. We need also to keep this question in mind. Hippolytus is, I think, peculiarly unattractive and self-satisfied, especially in the first part of the play. So the question, the hard question is, why does Euripides choose him as the object of Phaedra's shameful love? Why on earth did she fall in love with him? When we first meet him, he just seems obnoxious. So we'll come back to that. But to start, let's return to where we left off last time, Phaedra's decision to die. Let's go back through it. It's line 392 following. So we get this. I think we read this last time, but refresh our memories. Now I will tell you the way I reasoned it out. When love had wounded me, I looked about how I might best put up with it. I began with the resolve to keep quiet and hide my disease. You cannot trust the tongue, which knows well enough how to rebuke the willfulness of other people, but is its own worst enemy. Next, I intended to overcome my folly by my self-control and so endure it. Self-control there is sophronein, by being moderate. And thirdly, when I could not master Cyprus by these means, I thought it the best plan, none will gainsay me, to die. As I would not wish my good deeds to pass unnoticed, so I did not want a crowd of witnesses to my sin. To own the passion I knew would be no less disgraceful than if I gratified it. Besides, I realized full well that I was that object of universal detestation, a woman. A foul curse on the woman who first committed adultery with strange men. Strange there doesn't mean, peculiar men. It means foreign, men you don't know. It was from noble families that this evil first started, and when shameful things or ugly things seem to be beautiful things, then the common people will surely think them correct. Those women who talk about sophrosune, they talk moderation, but secretly have their disreputable affairs, I hate. Sea goddess Cyprus, how in the world can they look their husbands in the face without quaking for fear lest the darkness, the partner in their crimes, someday take voice, or the walls of their chambers? So it looks as though she presents her decision to die as the last of three stages in which she's thought through her situation. So first, she decided to keep silent about her love of Hippolytus. And then she tried to overcome it with moderation, with sophronein, with being moderate. And then when that failed, she resolved to die when she finds she can't prevail against Aphrodite. So she recognizes Aphrodite, she names her only when she finds that her love is too strong for her. Now, the first two stages are a little puzzling, though. It's strange. You think perhaps she should have reversed their order. Her order, she says, she kept silent first, and then she tried to overcome it by way of sophrosune, moderation. Her order makes it clear to us that we don't really know what she means by sophrosune, by moderation. It can't be struggling and winning a battle for self-control, because it looks as though she's already failed in that by virtue of the fact that she admits that she can't simply keep quiet about it. Now, Aphrodite, in a way, has told us already what Phaedra means by it. If you look back at line 29 following, you get this. She says, even before she came to this land of Trozen, she built a shrine of cypress there on the rock of Pallas, commanding a view of this land, because she loved an absent love. And the place she established she called Hippolytus Belvedere, in his honor forevermore. So it looks as though she gives an anonymous gift that is meant to appease Aphrodite. So she tries to treat Aphrodite like any other god. The chorus at one point think that she must have offended Artemis by not making sacrifices, and that's the cause of her trouble. So you could say Phaedra moves from not talking at all, that's her first stage, to talking to a god, to the silent speech of piety, to a kind of prayer, to, in a way, an anonymous speech. That's what sophronein, being moderate, seems to mean to her. And at the moment, she thinks Aphrodite, at this moment, she thinks Aphrodite has failed her because despite all of this, she's still in love with Hippolytus. And on the one hand, and on the other hand, Aphrodite still, despite her prayers, allows adulteresses to go unpunished. Now, Phaedra is herself, of course, powerless to punish adultery and adulteresses, and because of her shame, she's unable to join them. And yet, only if they are inevitably punished is it inevitable that she will have to punish herself. I mean, you could put it in a simple way. If it's the case that adultery isn't always punished, then it's possible that she could do it and not be discovered and not be shamed. So what does she conclude then? We're now at line 428, and we get this. Time, like a young girl, has a mirror, wherein, in his own good time, he shows the bad things of mortals. Among such may I never be seen. So, time, she wants to claim, inevitably reveals the bad things, but in fact, what she's really talking about is the way in which time unfolds for human beings and makes them, in Greek, aiskron means, on the one hand, shameful, but on the other hand, means ugly. So it's the opposite of kalon, which means on the one hand beautiful, on the other hand noble. So it looks as though time, in fact, only inevitably reveals ugliness in the sense that we all grow old and we lose we lose beauty. We lose the things that we pride ourselves on when we're young. So in fact, Phaedra's really just saying that love has made her aware of her mortality. And that's really all the punishment that adulteresses inevitably get, but of course, that's the punishment that we all get, regardless of whether we've committed adultery. Now, the nurse's reply is interesting at 434 following. At first, she seems to say that Phaedra should accept Hippolytus as a lover because love is both universal and irresistible. There's a marvelous image in which she says, she's talking about Aphrodite, Cyprus. She is in the waves of the sea. From her do all things spring. It is she that sows love and bestows it. And all we who are upon the earth are born of love. It looks as though she wants to say that, you know, it doesn't matter whether you're a fish or a human being, you're in some way affected by Aphrodite. So love is both universal and irresistible. But, you know, this really won't work. She said just before that, it's nothing odd or inexplicable that has happened to you, not love's passions, but the wrath of the goddess has swooped down over you. You're in love. What is remarkable in that? Many people are in the same state. Well, yes, many people, but not according to the nurse. Everybody, some people, lots of people, not everybody. So we need to sort of go back and look again. Now, the nurse says that Phaedra suffers from, you can see why Haddis has changed it. Mostly he's a good translator, but sometimes things just get too uncomfortable for him and he just won't do it. And so you get phrases like love's passion has swooped down over you, but in fact, the Greek tells you it's the anger of the goddess. So it's not, love's passion makes it sound rather desirable, but in fact, the nurse really says that Phaedra is suffering the wrath of the goddess, which means love has suddenly become a punishment. But if it's a punishment, what's the crime? Now, unlike Artemis in this play, Aphrodite never gives you her genealogy. She's given only one epithet. She's called Pontia, which means literally, that occurs at line 522, which means literally belonging to the sea. So this looks to be a very indirect reference to one of the stories about the birth of Aphrodite, which is supposed to be that this happens when Kronos, whose name is not identical to, but is a sound alike for Chronos, which means time. Chronos time has a chi, and Kronos, the god, has a kappa. But Kronos castrates his father, Ouranos, which means heaven. And in the act of castrating him, the sperm from his father falls into the sea, and Aphrodite is born from that event. So when he calls her Aphrodite of the sea, or when the nurse calls her Aphrodite of the sea, it looks as though this is a reference to the birth of Aphrodite. This is, it's Botticelli, isn't it? The Venus on a half shell. That's what that's a picture of. So, suggestion. The crime that's being referred to, for which love is a punishment, is the castration of Ouranos, which leads in, not directly, but eventually to the dethroning of the cosmic gods and the rule of the Olympian gods. So in the tradition, in Plato's Symposium, for example, Symposium is a wonderful dialogue. It consists largely of 6 speeches praising erotic love. And in the second of these speeches by a man named Pausanias, a distinction is made between heavenly Aphrodite and demotic or vulgar Aphrodite. And heavenly Aphrodite seems to be a reference back to an Aphrodite who's not like the other Olympians, but is herself a sort of pre-Olympian goddess born as a result of this attack on the cosmic gods. So love, why would Aphrodite be presented as a cosmic god rather than an Olympian anthropomorphic god? Love, this might be the case if love is understood to be the experience of a kind of necessity, not a law laid down by human beings or by anthropomorphic gods, but more like a law of nature, what's utterly beyond our control. And so to acknowledge it would mean to acknowledge one's weakness in the face of it. So acknowledging love would mean acknowledging one's defectiveness, one's powerlessness, that something happens to you that is utterly beyond your control. Looked at in a certain way, since we love to be in love, that's a great thing, but looked at it in another way from the point of view of your whole life suddenly being utterly taken out of your control, it's a source of shame that you're no longer in charge. So you could say the evidence that love is a kind of punishment is to be found in Phaedra's experience. She suffers from unrequited love. And the interesting thing about love is that it looks as though in order to be satisfying, it needs to be requited. And the difficulty is that there's absolutely, as you all know, as we all know, and I'm sure you all know, the fact that you love somebody doesn't mean that they're going to love you back. And the fact that you become overcome with a kind of passion doesn't mean that you will be treated in the same way. And so the fact that it's unrequited is a re-emphasis of the fact that something is happening to you that changes your whole life on the one hand and is utterly out of your control on the other hand. So what's the cure for it? Well, the cure for unrequited love and for the shame that it brings, I suppose, would be mutual love. I think that's what Phaedra thinks, that, that's what how the nurse actually tempts her. It is interesting that the nurse talks about a love filter, a love drug that she's going to use. You never get any account of it. Aphrodite at one point says, do you drink it or do you rub it on or what? And the nurse says, I don't know. But you'd think that she would know if she's the one providing it. And then you realize that you don't hear any more about it. It's not that she goes to Hippolytus and tries to apply some sort of fancy, salve or give him or slip him a drink of some kind. In fact, it looks as though what the nurse really believes is that the love drug will be announcing to Hippolytus that someone is passionately in love with him, and how can anybody resist that? Don't you fall in love with the fact that somebody's in love with you and you're so flattered? And much to her surprise, or partial surprise, he's repulsed by it, which means it doesn't work at all. But for her, it looks as though the love filter is that she's going to announce to him, look, this woman is passionately in love with you, and that ought to do the trick, but doesn't do the trick. But before we get that far, you could say the nurse urges Phaedra, in effect, to see if she can make Hippolytus fall in love, which means she urges Phaedra to punish Hippolytus. Love would make Hippolytus, presumably, see his own defectiveness in the same way Phaedra has come to see hers. She says to Phaedra, make Hippolytus also feel the law in the way you have felt the law, this sort of natural law, this law that it's impossible for you to overcome. Now, I don't think the nurse altogether believes all this stuff. Her mistress's life is in danger, so she's got to do something. So she's tried to make sexual pleasure attractive to Phaedra by presenting it as a punishment. Now, she tells us what her source for all of this is. This is at line 451 following. She tells us, those who possess the writings of the ancients and spend all their time with the muses know that Zeus was once madly in love with Semele. They know that dawn of the lovely light carried Cephalus off to the gods for the sake of love. So her source is the old poets. The old poets who present to us the gods who put us to shame by making clear what it is that's beyond our power. Now, how does the chorus respond to all of this? It starts at 525 following. We get a hymn to Eros. Eros, Eros, you make the eye misty with longing. It's very traditional in form. It's not traditional in content, though. The sign of this is that in the first strophic pair, Eros occurs 4 times. Eros, Eros, first of all, and then Aphrodite, which Eros, Zeus's boy, hurls from his hands, and then we revere not Eros, tyrant over men. It occurs 4 times. If we were looking at it in the Greek, we'd see that it occurs 4 times where it's the short e, the epsilon of Eros, occupies a place that metrically should be reserved for a long syllable. And if you change the epsilon to eta, which is what you would do if you made it long, since we've read Aristotle, we know that poets do that sometimes, lengthening, he calls it. But if it were an eta here rather than an epsilon, it wouldn't mean Eros, it would mean hero. So that's the first thing. Second thing, in the second strophic pair, we discover that Aphrodite delights in human sacrifice, while Eros, now called Zeus's boy, might be appeased by animal sacrifice. It's there, you have to push it a little, but in the descriptions we get. So Eros is a tyrant, but Eros can be wooed, can be civilized. Aphrodite apparently cannot be. So they pray to Eros, the chorus, as a means to control this pre-Olympian Aphrodite, this natural law of love. It's interesting, by the way, that this civilizing of the natural law of love involves changing the goddess Aphrodite into a god, Eros. Now, I mean, this is a digression within a digression, but a word on this difference between the male and female in this play. The chorus, you remember, vow that they won't speak of Phaedra's love, and Hippolytus too vows that he won't speak. He promises the nurse. Neither of them break their oath, but Hippolytus thinks of doing it. In what's probably the most quoted line of the play, he says at one point, "The tongue hath sworn, the mind not." So in the end, Hippolytus decides not to reveal what he's sworn that he won't say, because in order for anyone to believe him, he'd need witnesses, and the only witnesses are the chorus, but he never asks the chorus, not because of their oath, about which he really doesn't know anything, but because they swore it to Phaedra, they didn't do it in his presence, but because of his certainty that because they're women, they would just lie. So the men in the second half of the play are generally doubters. For example, Hippolytus' servant reports the miraculous accident of Hippolytus, and while Theseus concludes that it means that Hippolytus was guilty, the servant doesn't draw that conclusion. And then, to Hippolytus' suggestion that he consult an oracle, remember how scrupulous Theseus is, how much he values things like oracles. Theseus says, pol ego kairein lego, which means something like good riddance. It's interesting, these are exactly the words that Hippolytus uses to dismiss Aphrodite at line 100. No, I'm sorry, at line 78. So on line 78, is that right? Line 114. He says, I can find it. As for this cypress of yours, I bid her a long farewell. That's really idiomatically just good riddance. And then on line 1060, we get this, where Theseus says, for the birds of omen which fly overhead, I bid them a long farewell. So Artemis praises Hippolytus for keeping his oath, but the fact that the chorus keep their oath is altogether taken for granted, not even mentioned, leads to no praise whatsoever. Now, maybe the subtlest of Euripides' ways of pointing to the distinction between male and female is the third stasimon that starts at 1103. Hippolytus does something, you understand why he's done it, but it's not what he should have done. He divides the chorus into a chorus of women and a chorus of huntsmen. He assumes that it splits in this way. That's not in the original manuscripts in any way. What moves him and other editors to do it is that when the chorus are expressing doubts about divine providence, they use a male participle, kenthon LPD, hopes lying hidden. So it looks as though Euripides has them become male at the very moment they become doubters. So it looks like a grammatical indication of something he's trying to give you in other ways, but it doesn't really mean, I mean, he's calling attention to something he wants you to get at, a difference that he's trying to articulate between male and female, but it's not an indication that the chorus itself actually splits into male and female. So the claim seems to be that there's something naturally doubting about males and something naturally pious about females. We don't understand what that means yet, but just sort of note it and keep it in the background. And let's look at Hippolytus and see what happens when we come back to this. So he hates women. Why? It's not like most misogyny. It's not that he's had bad experiences with women, not that he's been crossed in love, for example. He has absolutely no experience with women whatsoever, other than the fact of his mother's dalliance with Theseus, and she's certainly not to be taken, Hippolytus not to be taken as the paradigmatic woman. She's an Amazon. Now, he gives a long speech at 616 to 68, which divides into two parts. In the first part, he argues, well, maybe we'll read that part, not the whole of it, but that part. Mine's just a little bit of Apollo and the Eumenides. Zeus, why did you let women settle this world of light, a curse and a snare to men? If you wished to propagate the human race, you should have arranged it without women. Men might have deposited in your temples gold or iron or a weight of copper to purchase offspring, each to the value of the price he paid, and so lived in free houses, relieved of womankind. Here is proof that woman is a great nuisance. The father who begot her and brought her up pays a great dowry to get her out of the house and be rid of the plague. The man who receives the poisonous weed into his home rejoices and adds beautiful decorations to the useless ornament and tricks her out in gowns. Poor fool, frittering away the family property. He is under constraint of his in-laws. If his in-laws are good people, he must keep his cheerless bed. If his spouse is agreeable, but a relative's useless, the evil he must accept oppresses the good. That's the first part of the speech. So children, he suggests, Zeus could have done it in this way. The consequence would have been children are identical to private property. There wouldn't be any city because there wouldn't be any need to exchange anything but goods with other people. There wouldn't be any such thing as illegitimate children because they would be just bought. Everybody would be as chaste as Hippolytus is. There wouldn't be any flawed, bad coins, only the real thing. The real thing Hippolytus understands to be males as opposed to females. He never asks why the gods didn't make women better. Apparently, if there are women, they are necessarily bad. That is, from Hippolytus's point of view, they will necessarily violate the law. It never occurs to Hippolytus to judge the law by what's natural. He judges what's natural by the law. So his scheme depends on keeping the law of private property. It turns out that abolishing nature from his point of view is better than canceling the law. He's so sure of himself that he says, The father who begot her and brought her up pays a great dowry to get her out of the house and be rid of the plague. He's sure that not incest, but paternal hatred is the reason for exogamy. That you get the woman out of the house because you want to be rid of her, not because it's necessary in order to avoid this kind of inbreeding. His standard for the law that he so admires is the property relationship, so in a way, money, which is in a way the most conventional manifestation of law. That's part one of his speech. Part two has to do with the fact that it's even worse to have a clever or wise woman in the house. This leads to his expression of contempt for Phaedra. He senses, I suppose, that if woman is bad, then maybe she's meant as a punishment. And if that were true, then by avoiding marriage, he'd be avoiding that punishment, which would be, in a way, impiety if it's the God's wish that we be punished. So Hippolytus says, if he has to marry, he'd prefer a stupid wife, and he wouldn't give her any servants, only dumb animals, because otherwise he couldn't count on limiting her wickedness. And while marriage is bad, he goes on to suggest that adultery is even worse. There's an indication of how seriously he takes the law. One might think that if marriage by law is bad, then adultery is simply nature's goodness taking its toll, nature reasserting itself. But that's not what Hippolytus thinks. Now, Phaedra hears all of this, and it breaks the spell. She bewails woman's lot. Women, she says, are punished as much for what they are as what they are thought to have planned as for what they actually do. And so she decides that it would be appropriate for Hippolytus to suffer exactly the same punishment. We get on 93 this, page 93, line 726. But I shall become a bane to another when I am dead. He may learn not to be superior about my troubles. When he has shared this illness with me, he shall learn to be moderate. Sophocles. So the man who tries to show women up with regard to what's supposed to be their distinctive virtue will have to experience the same suspicion that all women know. Now, it's worth noticing that Phaedra fails. Nobody believes her charge that Hippolytus raped her, other than Theseus. Hippolytus's defense of this charge is peculiar. In a way, it couldn't be worse. He defends himself against something that he wasn't accused of. That is, since he thinks all women are bad, he doesn't believe rape is possible. And since Theseus never tells him exactly what Phaedra wrote, Hippolytus ends up arguing the case that he never would have seduced her. Now, if he had considered rape, he could have said, if I did it, why didn't I kill her? Still, there's one thing that Theseus could have seen if he had been listening. This at line 1009, when we get this. Suppose my chastity fails to convince you, then it is for you to demonstrate how I was corrupted. Was it because this woman excelled all other women in beauty of body? Hippolytus apparently thinks that to fall short of perfect chastity means to want to sleep with everybody. He doesn't have any clue about how erotic longing singles out individuals in a way that seems utterly beyond one's will, and sometimes altogether unintelligible to everybody else. You know that phenomenon, don't you? I mean, haven't you been in the position of asking yourself the question, I wonder what she sees in her-him. You don't get it. And it doesn't stop when you're your age. I mean, it's one of the oddest thing about marriage is that I suppose it's due to the fact that the most important thing about it is invisible. And so what you'd have to know in order to evaluate it is what are these two people like when they're alone together? And in principle, you can't know that, so you can't know the most important thing. But nevertheless, I don't know how many dinner parties my wife and I left over the years, saying to one another as we were driving home in the car, "Can you believe so-and-so is married to so-and-so? What's that all? How is that possible?" And then you get to be in a way more moderate, because you realize that they may very well be saying the same thing about you, and you realize that there's a sort of problem here. But Hippolytus doesn't have a clue about that. He doesn't know that erotic longing has this very peculiar character to it. The faithfulness of erotic longing has to do with this sense that you get that the person with whom you've fallen in love is the one and only one that you could have fallen in love with. And, in any rational mind, that can't be true. I mean, that's just preposterous in a way, that there's only one person in the whole world. And yet, all you have to do is examine love poetry to see that that's the, and it seems to cross over different eras. It doesn't always show itself in quite the same way, but it always shows itself, this sort of faithfulness of erotic longing. So, only for one moment does Hippolytus seem to display a certain kind of self-knowledge. This at 1074, when we get this. O halls, would that you could utter forth a clear voice and bear witness whether I'm a base man. You take refuge in speeches, witnesses quite clever. This deed, though it speak not, testifies to your villainy. Alas, if only I could stand apart and look myself in the face, that I might weep at the evils I have suffered. Hippolytus looks around and sees that there's nobody in the world to pity him, and suggests, by the way he puts this, that only another Hippolytus could pity him. But there can't be another Hippolytus, because Hippolytus doesn't want a friend. He wants not another I, he wants his very self. So Hippolytus is entirely alone, notwithstanding his conversation with Artemis. She's female, she's a goddess of childbirth, she's not another Hippolytus. His chastity, then, is an expression of his uniqueness, his detachment from everybody else. He looked around for a god who was like him, someone he could claim he imitated, but he didn't find one. He doesn't really imitate Artemis. He's somehow naturally chaste. Unlike Phaedra, he doesn't pray to a god to be moderate. He's not tempted. He doesn't need a god. So there's a way in which you might say Hippolytus isn't a human type in any sense. He's not devoted to an ideal against which he measures himself and of which he falls short. That's a way of collecting people together and say, look, they all admire the same thing. They're a type. But he doesn't measure himself in that way. He's not a monk. Rather, Hippolytus is a complete individual. And it's when you realize that you begin to get a hint, our first hint, of what it means that Phaedra falls in love with him. Hippolytus, in a way, the perfect beloved. The perfect beloved would have to reflect that fateful individuality of love. The perfect beloved isn't a type, but would have to be totally himself. My one and only would really have to mean my one and only, not my one and only of this type, and if this doesn't work out, I'll try the other one. But a perfect beloved, and this is, I think, the clue to the play, hard to see in a way, but the perfect beloved is by nature chaste. Because the perfect beloved, emphasis on perfect, would have no need whatsoever of the lover. And so would be by nature untempted to return the lover's love. So the perfect individual is forever an object of love, but the perfect object of love really can't fall in love. So something comes out rather wonderfully in Plato's accounts of love, where it turns out that if you understand Eros asymmetrically, if you understand, you look at what moves the one who loves, the longing for the beloved, who is idealized to an extraordinary extent and presented as though perfect, if that beloved is really what the lover thinks it is, or he is, or she is, then, of course, this perfect being that you have prostrated yourself before would have absolutely no reason to be interested in you at all. If he or she is already perfect, then what's the point? If you manifest your insufficiency and your incompleteness by virtue of the fact that you fall in love with someone and can't control yourself, it looks as though it's like opposites, right? You long for the perfect, but why on earth should the perfect long for you? You're a sort of contemptible being who can't control yourself. So it looks as though once you understand it in that way, you idealize it in that way, you have in a way created a dynamic where unrequited love is almost built into the equation. You couldn't imagine it being anything else. If the object of your love is really what you think it is, then in fact there's no reason in the world for the thing that you love to love you back. Now, the shock of the Hippolytus, the play, is that once you see that that's what's at work, you see this other thing, that he seems to be altogether unlovable in this play. He seems to be someone that nobody would fall in love with. Now, that's not entirely correct. He is in a way in love. If you look at line 1079, you get this. This is directly after the passage we just read. You've had much more practice at regarding yourself than doing your duty by your parents as you ought. Unhappy mother, bitter hour of birth, may none of my friends ever be a bastard. So Hippolytus, this bastard, who is outside of the law, it's a birth not recognized by the law. This bastard is in a way in love with the law. In his uniqueness, his individuality, he longs for the universality of law. And so the end of the play is interesting because he starts to get his wish. So at 1131, we get this, the chorus. No more shall you mount the car of Venetian coursers, holding the hooves of your trained steed to the chariot course at Limna. The muse that was ever wakeful within the frame of the lyre will be heard no more in your father's house. So they're lamenting the passing of Hippolytus. The retreats of Leto's maiden in the green forest depths will stand ungarlanded. Your exile has killed the competition of the maidens for the prize of your love. But I, with tears for your calamity, I shall endure a life that is no life. You had no joy of your son, poor mother. Alas, I am angry with the gods. Woe, triad of graces, why do you let him go forth from his fatherland, from these halls, the poor sufferer? He was not the cause of the calamity. So this is the chorus. The funny thing about it, of course, is they say that he is, literally say, that he is musikos, that he's a musical is too narrow a word, but that he's someone somehow skilled at the things of the muses. Now, if you look back at line 989, it's not so clear in your English, but this is Hippolytus him saying, that too is quite natural. Those who are accounted of no consequence among the wise are musikos before the mob. And then he distinguishes himself from them. He claims that he's not musikos. They attach his fate to the Graces, who they say, who according to Hesiod, pour forth love from their eyes. Hesiod is the great epic poet, second only to Homer. And they say, most absurdly, this is wonderfully absurd, that all the girls of Troezen won't be able to chase Hippolytus anymore, that he's in a way the most eligible bachelor in town. What's their evidence for this? This isn't our Hippolytus. This is the Hippolytus we saw was anything but chased after by all the local girls. So they're doing something rather interesting. They're making him respectable. They're making him into someone whom it's possible to pity. What they're doing is transforming the Hippolytus, who is the character in this play, to the Hippolytus who turns out to be, and at the very end we get a hint of this when he's described in this way, Hippolytus of the cult of Artemis, in which before their marriage, virgins cut their hair and sing a dirge to Hippolytus. He's being made lawful in a way that he's not been lawful before. So apparently only by interpreting Hippolytus so that he becomes a representative of a certain stage of life, can he be pitied? You can say of Hippolytus, oh, he'll grow out of it. Eventually he'll grow up and marry. So what happens here is that the unique Hippolytus, who is the character in our play, gets universalized as a stage of life, something like adolescence or pre-adolescence, and therefore becomes universalized and a common feature of our lives, and therefore becomes a part of the law, of the way things are supposed to work. So the man who manifests the essence of love's illusion, that the one we love is an irreplaceable, unique individual, gets completed and absorbed into the law, but that can only happen after he dies. So the chorus mourn him in this way while he's absent. And when he returns, he undermines their makeover. He pities himself, and this is line 1362, with these words. He says, kakodaimona kai katartaton. Literally, that means with a bad fate, kakodaimona, and cursed. But the word kakodaimon is, you would think, would be the opposite of eudaimon. Bad fate, good fate. Eudaimon is a word Aristotle uses to talk about what it means for human beings to be genuinely happy, blessed. So kakodaimon on the surface looks as though it's the opposite of eudaimon, but it's really not in the language. It's an expression of vulgar contempt. In tragedy, in all the tragedies we have, it occurs only here. It never occurs in any of the Greek historians. It occurs 3 times in interesting places in Plato. It's all over the place in comedy. It's what you use in comedy to talk about someone that you want to think of as sort of vulgar and harmlessly contemptible. So when Hippolytus says here that he's kakodaimon, it's like his earlier use, early in the play, first scene, of boros chorestes. You remember glutting oneself with flesh, another expression that is particularly out of place in tragedy, and it occurred just right before the chorus jumped in with a celebration of doing their laundry in high tragic language. So as to call attention to how untragic his language was. He comes out ultimately as a character in comedy, someone to be slightly despised, someone not really to be pitied. Despite then what might seem the logic of love, in the end, we do not love the one who is so perfect as to need nothing. In the end, he does make us pity him a bit, but his last words to Theseus are a request to cover his face. It looks as though that's just a confirmation of what we've already seen, that only in death can Hippolytus make manifest a need that he has of anyone. So you could say this, as a kind of general remark about what the play is doing. It is in a way a play about the virtue that is characteristically ascribed to women: moderation, sophrosune. And it is an account of how thankless this virtue is, because it doesn't look as though anybody was ever simply celebrated for being moderate. It doesn't look like a high virtue. And this is a play, obviously, that contains some really harsh language about women that is, there's plenty of precedent for it You need to think about, I suppose, the way it's Eve who tempts Adam in the Genesis account, and then you have to think about the fact that it's Pandora who brings the terrible release of evils upon human beings. That's the first version we have of that is in Hesiod. So women get a bad rap in this sort of thing. Euripides is doing something interesting, though. He's, in a way, showing us that on the surface of it, it looks as though the reason for that has something to do with accepting this powerful tendency that Eros presents us with, which you might call the utter idealizing of the object of love as something perfect. And the difficulty with that turns out to be that when we start to work it out in practice, when we watch it, it turns out that we're actually not enamored of someone who's presented as perfect in this way. And therefore, it turns out that if moderation has to do with an acknowledgement of one's own imperfection, Euripides is in a way experimenting with the possibility that the quintessential human virtue is the one that's characteristically ascribed to women, and that the illusion of perfection is, in a way, under attack in this play. So, in a way, it turns out to be the case that we're supposed to learn from maybe I can just put it in this way, simple way of putting it. You have two main characters in this play, Hippolytus and Phaedra. I mean, it's a tragedy, so you don't want to be either of them. But if you had to choose, which one would you choose to be? She's certainly much more interesting than he is. Reminds me in a way of, Nietzsche writes a book called The Genealogy of Morals, and in the first essay, he talks about two kinds of morality, one of which he calls slave morality and the other of which he calls master morality. And it seems pretty clear that he's in favor of master morality. And the great thing about master morality, he gives this wonderful image. It's like the difference between birds of prey, eagles and lambs. Eagles fly around and they take what they want and they don't think twice about it, and they don't dislike lambs. They love what they call juicy little lambs. They're not resentful of lambs. The lambs, on the other hand, aren't so fond of the eagles because they get eaten up, and they resent the fact that they get eaten up. So they create a world in which they can say that these eagles should be behaving the way we behave. So Nietzsche makes a distinction between good and bad, sort of moral understanding of master morality, and good and evil, which at first glance it looks as though he's utterly contemptuous of. And interesting because, of course, it doesn't take long for him to identify good and evil and slave morality with the morality of first Judaism and then Christianity. But you read a little further more deeply in the first essay, and you discover some interesting things happen. There's a moment when Nietzsche's describing the priests that are generated out of the slave morality, and he calls them evil. And if you're paying attention, of course, that means that for whatever reason, he's adopting the slave morality. He's not behaving as though he's a master. He's behaving as though he's a slave. They're evil, but good and evil, that's slave morality. And then, in a way that's really more open, he makes it clear that while there's something sort of wonderfully innocent and unself-conscious and about master morality, it's a little bit like not to be born surpasses every logos. That you know, there's a sort of utter one-dimensionality and innocence. He says, you know, the slaves are infinitely more interesting. So it turns out that what that means is that he's tacitly, almost explicitly acknowledging that human beings are in some way by nature practitioners of slave morality. That's what it means. So it's Nietzsche's way of acknowledging that if you were speaking English, in English we have two meanings of the word self-conscious. On the one hand, it means self-aware in its philosophical sense, and on the other hand, it means being a little ashamed of yourself. So he's seen the connection between being self-aware on the one hand and being defective on the other hand. And in a way seen that despite the fact that our first inclination is to celebrate a kind of perfection, we're finally much more interested in what's interesting and not what's utterly perfect. And so there is a way in which it's inevitable that the cosmic gods, who are very simple manifestations of an unambiguous power of one sort or another, get replaced by the very, very ambiguous Olympian gods, who have affairs with one another, who deceive one another, who represent certain things, to be sure, Hephaestus fire, Ares war, but Ares, who represents war, is also a person who falls in love, who has an affair with Aphrodite. So it turns out that ambiguity, which suggests a certain lack of wholeness, incompleteness, is in the end more beloved by us than the perfection of Hippolytus. So Euripides is in a way doing that, and on the surface, of course, in order to do that, he's got to show you why you love Hippolytus, and it looks as though why you're supposed to love Hippolytus has everything to do with why women are held to be so contemptible. But once you realize that you don't love Hippolytus, you've got to reevaluate what he's doing with regard to the status of women. It's a hard, long story, and I don't think we've scratched the surface, but you know, you can always do more. So that's up to you.